Assalamu alaikum, Khawateen wa Hazrat. Waseem Ahsan welcomes you to lecture number 34 of Marketing for Nonprofits, MKT627 at the Virtual University of Pakistan. The component of learning is going to be recruiting volunteers. And as the topic suggests, we are going to look into why is it that we have to recruit volunteers and how do we go about that. Well, in terms of why is there a need for volunteers, I think we know very well by now that there are two groups working for the organization. One is the regular group, whereas the other one is the one consisting of volunteers. The volunteers are the ones who do not look for any financial gains or remunerations in return for the service they render. Rather, they are the people who like to give something back to the society they are a part of. And therefore, the exercise of the picking volunteers has to be a very select one. In other words, what I'm saying is it is not that since there happens to be a team of people willing to offer their services free of cost to the organization, we go for a random exercise and pick anyone who comes the first for that particular service. As a matter of fact, this process has to be quite very strategic. Now, when I talk about that, there are certain factors with which we are very familiar, and we have to take those factors into account before we really can pinpoint recruitment of volunteers. I think it also goes without saying that there has to be a very good match or very good fit between the volunteers and the kind of job they're supposed to be doing. There are different kinds of jobs at various levels of the organization that people have to do. And again, there are people who happen to be regular staff, and there are going to be people who happen to be volunteers. So therefore, we've got to see to it that the overall team that ends up executing a particular program of a nonprofit happens to be the one that is very well harmonized, very well gelled into each other, and are quite very clear about the goals of the organization they're supposed to be following and achieving. And there happens to be a few strategic factors that are to be considered before recruitment of volunteers takes place. Those are things like the market, its segments, meaning the segments of the market that nonprofit organization is going to address. And then, of course, the positioning of the product, or in other words, the positioning of the program. Because if the organization is well conversant with all these three factors, which in most of the cases it is, unless it makes a glaring mistake of deviating from its position or the core mission, then things are going to be different. But the fact is, if all these factors are in place and we are absolutely clear about the segment or the segments of the market that are to be addressed, and we are very clear about the positioning of the product, there is no question of making any mistakes. And toward that, I would say that there are certain features that have to be looked into in order to make sure that the market, the product, its positioning, the segments all fall in place when people are working for those particular segments. And what really makes those considerations fall in place are things like the demographics and lifestyles and attitudes of people who want to volunteer. Because until the time we are clear about the kind of people that we are looking for, and the basis of looking for those people happen to be things like their education level, their income level, their marital status, and their stage of for the profession they happen to be at, whether they are into the thick of their professions or they are retired people. These are the kind of features that make us look into those deliberations that are absolutely essential to make sure that the positioning of the product remains very intact, and the segments of the population or the market that we are after are addressed very rightly. Another factor is the lifestyle. We have to look into all kinds of people who are willing to offer their services. There are people who happen to be, for example, very moneyed, and they are either retired or not very much involved into professional life. They could be a group of people willing to work for the organization. Now, the question here is, where do they really fit in? Is there going to be a beautiful fit between their backgrounds and the objectives of the organization? Despite the fact that the lifestyle happens to be very interesting, they don't really have to worry about the challenges of life in terms of economic terms. It is only that they want to be very active on the social front. But the question is there going to be a good fit between their backgrounds and our goals? Again, along with lifestyles, we get back to the demographics. And this precisely is the concept where we combine demographics with psychographics. And as we are very familiar with the concept that the psychographics also take us back to demographics because it is there that we try to relate the lifestyle things with what really are the realities of life and in terms of their education level. For example, if a person happens to be very enthusiastic about doing a certain job, but if he doesn't really have the kind of education background which creates that fit that we are looking for, that person is no good as a volunteer. The third feature that I indicated very briefly is the attitudes. And attitudes, I would say, things like what is it that the people really want to give back to the society and why? And if they have attitude on those lines, what is it that makes that person motivated to do that particular job? So we can say that it is the market, the product or the program, its positioning, and the segments of the market that basically are the determinants of the kind of volunteers that we are looking for. And when we start looking for those volunteers, there are certain features that we have to look into. And those features, just to summarize, once again, are demographics, psychographics, and the attitudes. And the fact is that the attitudes and lifestyles are part of psychographics, and psychographics, like I said, also go back to demographics. But what is important here is we have to look at uh, three the different areas where we need the volunteerism. We need volunteers because we need to have people who can solicit donations. Now, here you may get surprised. Why is it that the volunteers do that? And why isn't it that the regular staff should do this job? Well, the answer lies in the fact that regular staff are the people who should look into this primary the job of the nonprofit organization, which is fundraising, because until the time that we have funding available, we cannot execute our programs. And therefore, the answer resting on the side of the regular staff is very well founded. But the fact is, we need volunteers for fundraising as well. I will let you imagine for a while why I say that before I give you the answer. Well, the answer lies in the fact that the board members also going to happen to be volunteers because they do not work for financial remunerations in most of the cases. I don't say always, but in most of the cases. And therefore, they also can be very effective volunteers. And the fact of the matter is that they do happen to be volunteers and they do help the NPOs on the fundraising front. As a matter of fact, they could very well be donors by themselves. And even if they do not happen to be the donors, they can influence their peers toward making donations. And therefore, they are extremely important to the organization in terms of being very high profile the volunteers. I would say a few words more on this particular phenomenon a little later. But back to three different categories of the volunteers. One, for fundraising. They are the ones who solicit donations. The other category is where you need the volunteers from a certain professional disciplines, and they are the ones who offer services in their particular specializations. So, for example, doctors, the lawyers, engineers are offering their services in their particular areas. More on this a little later as well. And then you see there is a third classification of the volunteers, and that is the people offering their services in areas which do not happen to be their specializations, or in other words, outside of their areas of specialization. This holds true for all those people who happen to be professionals, but they are retired people, or somehow they have to be, they happen to be in a situation in which they can offer their service. They have time and they have knowledge, they have expertise, they have different skills, but they can offer their services based on all the factors that I've talked about in kind of a generalized manner. So, in other words, even if there happens to be an engineer, he may or she may offer services outside their expertise by being um, a, a sensible and a knowledgeable asset available to the organization. So basically, there are the three the categories, and that we can surmise on the basis of all this that I've talked about, that that we've got to be very choosy and selective in terms of recruiting volunteers, and that we need volunteers at different levels of the organization, starting right from doing the transportation job to the level of soliciting funds. And for soliciting funds, we may have volunteers as highly placed as directors of the board of directors. And let me give you a couple of examples. If we go back to the example of the food bank, I think that we do need the people who can transport the food from different restaurants or the banquet companies where they can collect those the leftovers, or even if they are, the givers are giving on daily basis food that is specially prepared for needy neighborhoods, fine. But the fact remains that we need to have volunteers who can pick that food and then distribute among the needy neighborhoods. Again, it can be a collection or a combination of regulars and temps, meaning temporary volunteers. So if we are very sensitive to our needs at the level of the transportation, which happens to be a very low level kind of a need, but at the same time an extremely significant need, because if we do not have transportation, we cannot collect food and we cannot distribute food. So there are different levels. The highest level I already have talked about. So what I'm saying is that there are different levels at which we need volunteers, but the bottom line is that we've got to create a match between the backgrounds of people who are available as the volunteers and the factors of for the marketplace that require our looking into those characteristics that should be the basis of recruitment. So let me take you to the very uh, simple and plain graphical illustration which summarizes this particular concept. As you can see from this slide, we have product side on the left hand presented by blue color, and then we have on the right side characteristics of the volunteers. These are the things I've talked about. Looking back at the product side, we have the product, then we must be very clear about the positioning of the product, which makes it essential for us to look for the right people who can work for that particular positioning, because we know that positioning is translated into so many different strategic factors, and we have to have people who really fit into those factors. And then we have the target market. So you can see these arrows which basically reflect interaction, and they also reflect the matching between the two boxes that further contains three boxes each in themselves. Now, getting onto the right side, we have demographics right on top, then we have lifestyle, and then we have attitudinal features. And you can also see that I've tried to connect to see the lifestyle with the attitudes as psychographics, because this is the factor of psychographics. And then we also know, and I've talked about that so many times, that psychographics always go back to demographics, And that is where we have a beautiful mix of the factors that provide us with some very solid the marketing formulation of the good strategies. But the fact is that there has to be a beautiful match between what our purpose is, and the purpose is defined by the market, the positioning, and the targets or the segments, and then we have the features that we should look for in order to have that right match. Now, the next question is how do we go ahead with the recruiting? Once we know that there are certain features and characteristics that we have to be very sensitive to, we have to follow a certain process of recruitment. The recruitment campaign consists of four different factors with which, again, we happen to be very familiar, and those are the factors that define the model of behavior change. I talked about the behavior change model in terms of influencing the behaviors of our target market, or for that matter, our clients. And basically, when I talked about that model, it was in the context of the clients, meaning people we were trying to reach as our market, because they were the ones as the subjects of that particular market. For example, the people we were trying to reach because we were trying to convince them of the efficacy, the benefits of a family planning campaign. So the model was talked about in terms of that kind of a social marketing campaign. Here, I'm going to talk about this particular model in the context of recruiting the volunteers. Um, just like we must know the stage where our clients happen to be in terms of the behavior change model, we have to be very uh, clear about where they exactly are in terms of recruiting volunteers. So, in other words, we again start with the very first stage, which is pre-contemplation. So, in other words, we need to make sure that the people that we are looking for happen to be very clear about the objective of the nonprofit organization. In other words, they must know what the program is all about. Because once they are clear about our objectives and the existence of the campaign, they are going to make the final decision whether they are going to go further ahead or drop out then and there. So, therefore, it um, all boils down to creating awareness of a decent level among the target market of volunteers that there happens to be a cause, and if they are willing to work for that cause, the cause happens to look like the following. So it is at the awareness stage that we either strengthen the feelings of those potential volunteers, or make them drop out. I think it has to be a very honest process whereby the people should not be lured into something which later they may find kind of demotivating, or not exactly according to what they had thought of. And this exactly takes us back to the features that I talked about just a while ago, that we have to create the right match between the background of volunteers and our programs, meaning the market and positioning of the products, so on and so forth. And this takes us on to the next stage, which is the contemplation stage. And I must say, this is a very significant stage because it is here that we, on top of creating awareness on part of our target audience, educate the targets. And we educate our target market by talking about all the features of the program, so that they can really get ready to take the action for which we think they are the right people to be recruited. And therefore, it becomes absolutely essential on part of the nonprofit organization to talk very honestly about all the features of the program, so that the people are imparted the knowledge um, from different standpoints. They must know all the dimensions of the program, which means complete education, so that they really can be efficient and at the same time effective. Now, here we are not to lose sight of one very important dimension, and that is that this happens to be a very high involvement action, and which requires some costs on part of the potential volunteers. And therefore, we have to relate all this with the four factors that we already have learned in terms of the benefit, cost, others, and self-efficacy. These are the four factors which are going to really define the transition from contemplation stage to the action stage. Now, here we look into the kind of benefits which volunteers derive and the cost they pay. And we also look into the factor of others, meaning they are motivated by others who are into a similar situation or who have been working for this particular organization or this kind of a cause before. And then we also will look into the factor of self-efficacy. But going back to the benefits, what really are those benefits? Well, those are the ones that we keep talking about, we keep learning, and we know very well by now that people like to work as volunteers because they have so many different considerations, and all those are very positive. They want to work as the volunteers because they think they will be counted on. They want to work as volunteers because they think they can improve their skills. They can help people who are in need. So, in other words, they can be a helping hand. They can contribute toward the society they are a part of, and they can pay back to the society. They can be an agent of change. So, these are some of the benefits which they think they're going to derive. And the fact is, all these benefits translate into the factor of self actualization. They develop a certain level of self esteem, whether they claim it or not. They may say they don't really care about these things, but the fact is, in the heart of their heart, they feel happy, they feel content, and they feel very encouraged by being able to help the society. And if they happen to be kind of a little extroverted on this particular front, they may also like to publicize that they happen to be volunteers and they are doing this particular job because they want to actualize the certain preferences or certain values which they hold very dear to them. And then you see that we have costs. I mean, the cost which these volunteers pay. It is generally said that the level of costs is directly proportional to the level of involvement which a volunteer has. So, in other words, if it happens to be a very high level involvement, which it is, and it happens to be an involvement which is for an extended period of time, day in and day out, then of course the cost in terms of time is going to be very high. The social cost can also be high because these people may not have time to give to their friends and relatives. They may also do this at the cost of certain the family commitments, but then they are so much committed to this society or to a noble cause that they are willing to pay a very heavy and high cost for the benefit which they think or they are convinced they're going to derive. And then you see the factor of others. I think it's a good kind of revision of the factors that we have learned already. Others, they play a very important role because it is not just the factors of motivation that may be enough in so many different situations. So, in other words, what I'm saying is there could be situations in which people are self-motivated and they don't really have to have anybody else further convince them to take the next step. They are self-motivated and they are just about ready and set to take the action. But then you see, there are the people who need to have some kind of further motivation from those who have been into a similar situation. And this is where the factor of others comes in. And once they are encouraged by others, they become very highly motivated and become a part of the team of volunteers who are all set to take the action. And then the factor of self efficacy. I think it again happens to be an important factor because this is kind of a situation in which the people again are rather motivated and they want to do a job. They're also convinced they can do the job. whether it happens to be within the same specialization, which happens to be their area of strength, or it happens to be outside their specialization because they think they are generalists of of a high level, and they can do anything for the organization, but they feel there are certain constraints, and those constraints might present themselves in terms of time, or in terms of transportation, or in terms of any other things or odds which are in conflict with the programs they want to be a part of. And here, it becomes the job of the nonprofit organization, or for that matter, the regular staff members at the higher level, to convince these people that they can do the job, and the organization is flexible enough to create the kind of fit which is required between their skill sets and the organizational goals. So here you see the responsibility or the onus that lies on the nonprofit organization that has to play this role, where the factor of the self-efficacy is strengthened on part of those potential volunteers. And here, I think this goes without saying. I really feel very actuated to add here that the nonprofit just cannot play its role until the time it is very clear about the backgrounds of the volunteers, until the time it really has gone through a sifting process whereby they know different groups of volunteers that they can offer a match with the organizational goals the NPO is working on. They cannot go ahead with the recruitment process in an effective way. So this that takes us back to the concept that I talked about just a few minutes ago. The demographics and psychographics and the factors of the marketplace, all those have to be playing their role at the same time for the top management or the recruiters on the side of the organization to do their job very honestly, objectively, and effectively. So once this phase is over, and the education is imparted to the potential volunteers, and we as a nonprofit also going to have taken into consideration all the factors of the benefit, cost, others, and self-efficacy, that we move on to the next phase, which is the preparation and action. And here you see that we've got to prepare the volunteers in real life situation. You know, just theoretical education or talking about the prominent and salient features of the program is not merely enough. They have to get into details by giving certain practical demonstrations of the programs they are going to offer at site, wherever you see the program is to be executed. And therefore, uh, those circumstances and those situations could have to be simulated, of which these volunteers should be a part, so that they do not they face any discouragement or the demotivation at the sight of the volunteering wherever they are working. And the backbone of this particular stage happens to be the contemplation stage which preceded this particular stage. Once we have imparted education and have prepared our volunteers as um, potential members of the team, which is going to work side by side with regular staff members, we are all set with these people to work in the marketplace and to start working on the programs. And this, of course, goes without saying that this has to be a very harmonious kind of a team, very cohesive team, which works in the same zeal and in the same manner as anybody within the team is working. So it has to be a team which is much bigger than the sum of its parts. The next and the final stage or phase in this the particular model we all know is that of retention. that we have to retain. Now, here you see we do not retain customers. I'm not talking of customers because we retain volunteers. The reason I'm talking about retention of volunteers is because volunteers do have a tendency, which is kind of a natural inclination to drop out at a certain stage. And the fact of the matter is that they can leave at any stage because they're not regular staff members. They're not paid by the organization. They just happen to be people who are working because they want to give. And they're working, you see, with that particular sense of giving. And they can, drop out of the program anytime they like. So what happens then? In order to keep them from dropping out, you have to keep them motivated all the time. And there are certain ways and means whereby you keep them motivated. And I'm going to talk about that a little later. But before that, uh, we have to make sure that these retained volunteers are just like the retained consumers on the commercial side. Who are the retained consumers or customers? Well, they are the loyal customers. And the loyalty is something that we create by offering a combination of so many different strategic factors. It is not just the colors of the product, it is not the brand name of the product. It is a complete strategic exercise that we have learned to see um, in a thorough manner, which is complete raising of the brand and formulation of the different strategies at the organizational level that come into play to make a certain brand as strong as it is, and then create customer loyalty. By the same token, we have to do things through our strategic dispensation that our volunteers stay motivated at all times and they do not opt out of the program. And the retained the volunteers are like loyal customers. There is a little difference here which I would like to draw between the commercial side and the nonprofit side. On the commercial side, we have the loyal customers, and that loyalty basically emanates from a transaction or a repetitive series of transactions, because that's what loyalty is all about. It is a repetition of a particular behavior. People buy that particular product over and over again because they're loyal to that particular brand name. Conversely, on the nonprofit side, we have the retained or loyal the volunteers because they happen to be loyal out of a relationship. So, as transaction plays a significant role on the commercial side, relationship plays as important a role on the nonprofit side. So, as opposed to transaction, we have relationships. If we have good relationships, we have the good volunteers. If we do not have good relationships, we do not really have good volunteers. And if we have the good volunteers, naturally we have satisfied the volunteers. If we do not have good volunteers, they're not satisfied volunteers. But before I talk about this particular factor in detail, let me give you a list of reasons why they are demotivated. Because here, we should be more concerned with what really demotivates our volunteers than what really motivates them. Meaning, what is it that makes them dissatisfied and what is it that makes them satisfied? This is kind of a distinction that we must understand. And the factors could happen to be um, plain, logical, rational ones. They are not the ones that stem from the very high-flying kind of a theoretical framework. No, we don't really have to propound a behavioral model. Actually, these are matters of common sense and certain rationale that we have to give a lot of serious consideration to. The people happen to be, volunteers happen to be demotivated because they are not considered as the part of the team of the organization. Volunteers could have a feeling that they are second-class citizens or second-class staff members of the organization only for the fact that they are not paid employees. So this is kind of a feeling that has to be dispensed with. It all depends on the organization to what extent they can do away with this kind of a feeling. But the fact is, in many um, NPOs, this factor afflicts their culture, where volunteers they do get demotivated. Another factor which is extremely interesting is that the volunteers themselves happen to be unrealistic. They fantasize the nonprofit sector or the nonprofit environment, or for that matter, the nobleness of the program, which of course happens to be very noble, but the environment within which they work is something they look upon with a lot of enthusiasm. And that is why I say they happen to be a little unrealistic and not very practical when it comes to making the final decision of going ahead with volunteerism. Um, and they, in the process, they become motivated because they do not really find things exactly according to their taste and according to their thought or the kind of images which they had of for the nonprofit environment, the internal as well as external environment. And it is at a much later stage that they realize this really is not their cup of tea and they should be out of it. And then there is another factor that is from the side of the organizations. NPOs they happen to be quite unrealistic in terms of luring or enticing the volunteers by making certain, I would say, promises which are not very true, and talking about things which they do not happen to be the way they were talked about when the volunteers were enticed. And once they join the organizations, they find things quite very contrary to what they were told. And therefore, there happens to be kind of a mismatch between their backgrounds or between them and the organization, and they become demotivated. And then you see there is lack of the proper training. Like I talked about this particular factor as part of the behavior change model in which influencing the behavior as part of the contemplation stage, which happens to be a high involvement stage, is extremely significant here as well as a demotivating factor. I must talk about this once again that the people are not fully trained. And if they're not fully trained, they feel kind of caught up because they cannot perform as well as their counterparts who happen to be regular staff members. Again, having a great feeling of not having something which others have. They think they are deprived of um certain skills which the others have, and they do not. So this is a sense of deprivation which is created by not imparting the right level of training while volunteers are recruited. And then there could be a factor of a lack of the proper feedback. If we do not give proper feedback to the volunteers, they get demotivated because there are volunteers who work very well and who work, side by side, uh, shoulder by shoulder with their counterparts who are the regular staff members, and they know that they work as well as others, and in certain cases, they make the work even better than the regular staff members. It all depends on the basic skills and the level of motivation of a certain person, how hardworking he or she could be. So, if they have that kind of a feeling and there's no feedback from the organization, they are bound to be demotivated because they think there is no connection between them and the organization. There's a disconnect. And then you see that there is the factor of excessive the demands on their time. Now, this again is something that reflects the unrealistic thinking on part of the organization. I would say the more so on part of the organization and less so on part of the volunteers, because anybody who is going to work for the organization, may that person going to be a volunteer, or may he or she be a regular staff member, they have to be fully educated of the time factor, meaning the demands which are going to be placed on those people in terms of their time investment. In particular, the volunteers, because we are basically talking about volunteers. So let us confine ourselves to volunteers. Uh, they joined the organization in the hope that they would be working for a certain number of hours. And there could be a situation in which they were told that they would be required for X number of hours during a week. Whereas reality happens to be different. Um, the demand on their time happens to be much higher than what they were indicated. And people get demotivated because they have other commitments as well. And then you see a lack of sense of accomplishment. This is very well related to the factor that I talked earlier in terms of feedback. If people think that their accomplishment has not been acknowledged, they are bound to be demotivated. And if somehow they happen to be um, not accomplished volunteers, even when they have been given good feedback, um, maybe they have their own standards which are extremely, extremely high. So, whatever is the reason, it has to be looked into by the organization, because they are the ones who have to be very clear about factors that demotivate the volunteers. So, the list could be longer than what I have talked about, and the factors that I just enumerated are not an exhaustive list. Rather, they are a few of the most, or rather more prominent ones. But the fact remains that there has to be a good level of relationship between the organization and the volunteers. Here, I would like to talk about a factor in addition to the level of relationship, the meaning talking plainly about what a relationship is, or what is the importance of relationship. Let me add a few words here why relationships are so important. They carry a sense of emotionalism. This sense of emotionalism could also lies on the other side, which is the commercial side. People are very emotional, you see, when it comes to brand loyalty. But here you see, it is a question of relationships. And if we agree with the concept that relationship marketing is an extremely important dimension of nonprofit marketing, then we've got to pay um, added importance to this particular factor. Relationships basically are a function of the trust and respect. So you see, the two factors which they basically equate emotionalism. If I were to draw an equation, I would say emotionalism or emotions equal trust plus respect. Now, trust plus respect. This could be very high and this could be very low, or this could be somewhere in between the two limits on the spectrum. So, whatever it is, this level is the one that defines the level of emotions. And I think it goes without saying, having known this equation, because we can say that the higher is the level of respect and trust, the higher is the level of emotionalism. And once people become very emotional about the cause they are working on, and they develop an emotional bond with the cause as well as with the organization, they stay and stick with the organization. Now, here, let me add a few words. Why is it that this level of emotionalism um, gets breached in organizations where you find dissatisfied volunteers or demotivated the volunteers? It is because of I would say three precise reasons that I have jotted down for your benefit. And I would say the first one is there are no written contracts. And written contracts are the ones that they define the relationship between regular staff members and the organization. Now, if organizations think that volunteers do not have to be given those written contracts, they are mistaken. They have to have those contracts whereby they can formalize a relationship with the volunteers. I will talk about this factor in detail later. But the other reason is that there are no proper job descriptions known as JDs in our the business management language. In the absence of those JDs, the people are bound to be demotivated and dissatisfied, not having the kind of level of emotions that is a function of respect and trust, because they're not absolutely clear about what exactly they're supposed to be doing. So organizations thinking that the volunteers, because of the nature and the background of volunteerism, should not be given formalized the job descriptions, again, is a great flaw. These the volunteers have to be given the JDs so that they can come up to the level of their peers who are working with them within the nonprofit organization. And the third factor is there is no formal evaluation of their performance. Again, I would say that nonprofit organizations do not find it absolutely essential on their part to give a feedback in terms of the performance appraisal when it comes to the volunteers. When you work for an organization and you work very hard, you do expect an appraisal of how you have done. And if you are given an objective appraisal, and if the appraisal happens to be very positive, you certainly would be a very satisfied, a loyal, and an emotional volunteer and a worker and an asset for the organization. So, in other words, you as managers could have to make sure that the level of satisfaction of volunteers remains very high and you achieve the kind of emotional level that I just talked about, because that is something which has been proven by way of the research conducted by experts in this particular field. And therefore, it is of the utmost significance that people are not demotivated, they're not dissatisfied, especially when they happen to be the volunteers, because it is not just a question of the written contract, which I cited as one of the three factors which, if we have, can motivate people, and if we don't have, demotivates the people. As a matter of fact, in addition to that formal contract, there is a psychological contract between the volunteers and the organization. And this psychological contract is something that, again, that has been proven by way of research conducted by experts in this particular field. And a breach of that particular psychological contract means dissatisfied and disloyal volunteers. Now, there are those the factors which I'm going to summarize that motivate the volunteers. And I think it is going to be a summary of the whole thing that I've talked about so far. The motivated or loyal volunteers say they are motivated because their contribution is valued. Their opinion is given a lot of consideration. Even their criticism is taken by the organization very seriously. Their well-being is considered as something dear to the organization. So these are the kinds of factors which summarize the whole concept that I've talked about. And I think as long as we can take care of these factors, we are all set to recruit the right volunteers. Thanks.